live with the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Right Honourable Winston Peters. Good afternoon, Mr. Peters. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me on.
It's lovely to see you again. It's been a long while since I've seen you, and you're looking exactly the same. I'm looking far greyer and more troll-like. So whatever's in your DNA, I wish I had some.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so, but yeah, I don't remember you with a beard. That's the point.
That's exactly right. I was, the last time we spoke, I think, was for a previous iteration of a podcast that I did with comedian Jeremy Elwood, based out of Auckland, out of the New Stalk ZB studios. And no, I probably didn't have a beard. But you see what happens, Mr. Peters, is you move to Dunedin and you get bought into the culture and you let your Celtic roots come out through your pores, and then that's sort of the end of it. And that's what we do.
Very hard to grow a beard.
Is it for you? You're not a beard grower? Is that why you're always clean shaven?
No. When I was working in the freezing works, I used to work in the freezing chambers, and having a beard was a good idea because it's so darn cold.
Yeah.
But the first few days or weeks are pretty itchy. I found that darn difficult.
Is that something in politics?
I tried to grow a moustache. You try to grow a moustache, and after every day. About day 5, you made a mistake, cut one side off, and I gave that up after about 3 tries. Called it a bad idea.
I mean, I would always hope politics is always about good ideas primarily, but there does seem to sort of be an appearance to it. Is the beard a bit of a non-goer for politics? People like the clean-shaven MP, that's a more trustworthy face?
Depends on the nature of the government. You remember Fidel Castro did pretty good with a beard, and longer than anybody else.
That's true, actually. Yeah. So maybe for particular ideologies, it doesn't go too bad. Hey, I just saw a headline that came through. TVNZ had just had a $26 million loss, like literally hot off the press. I'd love to get your first kind of thoughts around that, if you've got any.
Well, long before COVID-19 arrived, the media was, as you know, in big trouble. It's a change of the medium and the use of other utilities. Facebook, you've got Google, you've got everything going on, all sorts of social media. So the industry was in a state of serious reconfiguration, and a lot of work has been done to make sure that the industry, in terms of its essence, it can survive. Otherwise, if we're left to just social media in the future, then our democracy will be in a rather parlous state.
Do you think it's time for TVNZ, at least TV1, to go kind of full BBC, full public broadcaster?
Well, it's a very interesting debate here, because when you speak to the political environment and all sorts of so-called experts, the question that they don't seem to answer is, what do you want out of your national radio or your national TV station? And if it is to ensure that it is part and parcel of a growing culture in a country, that's a shared culture, if that's not understood to be essential, then very quickly it becomes difficult to sustain it. And we've had what you might call a sort of partial acknowledgement of that without the structure and the establishment around it. So we've not been like the BBC in that context. We've been a mixed bag with all sorts of requirements, and many of the requirements of balance and fairness and neutrality, and dare I say it, journalistic and media excellence, haven't been reached in the way they should have been reached. It's not a matter of the country's size. It's a matter of what you strive for. Ireland has demonstrated that. The Nordic countries demonstrate that, and so could we.
Do you think that means there's sort of no way to then move towards that more independent BBC model? Because I guess what I hear you saying is the media in general is already slightly biased or slightly leaned one side, and because that's already the level of reporters and the way it's operated, what, TVNZ couldn't then adjust and move down that path?
The problem when you say that, it's like being on the paddock and always, griping with the referee. But I can give you countless examples where, for example, you have, and TV3 is The Nation, and then you have Q&A from TV1. Then they have a panel to evaluate what the guest has just said. Excepting the panel's all always from the left and the right, but nothing's from the middle. And it never occurs to them, this can't be balanced. If you follow me, and then put aside just Winston Peters and New Zealand First, but if there were other parties in the middle, where would the balance be? And there's no attempt to get to balance. And they've got some silly idea that if you've got a biased person on the left and a biased one on the right, somehow the truth between the two will fall in the middle and give the middle party a fair go. Now, I'm not whinging about the referee in this case, other than pointing out the patently obvious, since, dare I say it, 1993, when the first referendum came in, where we went to MMP in 1996. So we had all those years to adjust, but adjust they will not.
It seems to be the way of the media, doesn't it, in general, that, there's 10% on the, let's say, far right and 10% on, let's say, far left and 80% of us in the middle. Yet, as you say, it's the extremities that seem to make up most of the commentators and most of the noise within the media.
Well, I think, how shall I say it? In that sort of environment, you're not getting the best out of MMP for a start. And we don't see the stability in Europe and some other countries where MMP's been around for a long time and where the media understand the contribution of various parties. We don't see it in this country. And you get all sorts of commentators that, for example, will say, look, the tail of that dog is wagging the whole dog, so to speak. It's the tail wagging the dog. I've heard all these trite, cheap things being said. And the answer to that is really, so what did you think on election night when it looked like they didn't have your party the numbers, or your other party had the numbers? What did you think on election night about the tail wagging the dog? And you never raised it then. The second thing is that you can't wag the dog, so to speak, unless you've got a coalition agreement. And all you're doing is insisting upon the things you agreed to do. But it's a funny old world. It's a bit like they used to say to me when I was in the law, once money passes hands, all sense of obligation goes flying out the window. And once commitments are made, all sense of duty and fidelity in politics seem to go flying out the window. And we've got to strive to make sure that's not a fact, because if it is, then we'll get the worst possible outcome.
You were talking about MMP just then and about how we do it. I saw an article in the last couple of days where I think you were saying that National doesn't really play the MMP game very well. I've always thought National seems to play politics quite well, and an example is the Axe seat in Epsom, whereas the Labour, the left doesn't seem to play those games so well. I mean, it would be a perfect election for Labour to gift one of the Greens a seat to keep them in there. What do you mean by they don't play MMP as well? They're not very good at MMP versus very good at politics.
Well, look, Helen Clark tried that with the Greens in Coromandel, right, for one election. And she realised how fatal that is. So she never went back there. And Labour's still in that position. Whereas the National Party thinks they can do that in Epsom. And here comes the rub. Neither of them together can possibly get close to winning the next election. That's the reality. I'm not saying it from a point of view of New Zealand First bias, but from a point of view of experience. So if you work it out that way, you've got a spokesperson for finance in the National Party called Goldsmith, and he holds the only record in the world amongst all democracies, or dare I say it, one-party states. He's the only person seen and photographed worldwide pulling his hoardings down. Not his opponents, but himself. Now, really, there comes the word here called political cuckold. Now, I know it's a rather ancient and old word, but it does actually bespeak whether there's any integrity in the behind-the-scene arrangement of such a conflagration of arrangements, so to speak. It just doesn't make any sense. Either you're serious about Epsom or you're not.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, and I wonder as well, in this election, looking, and I'm not gonna ask you about the polls because everyone has every time they talk to you, and you always poo-poo them. In fact, what I was going to say to you is about the polls, not ask you about your polls, but I'll ask you this one first. Why are the polls always wrong? Because rather than say, oh, Winston, it's 2% of the poll, you'll just say, don't believe the polls. So why don't we believe the polls? Why do you think the polls are wrong?
Well, in my case, in New Zealand First case, it's 27 years of being put down by the pollsters, making all sorts of statements, ignoring facts, for example, that in 2002, 7 weeks out from the election, we were on about 1.5%. Well, 7 weeks later, we're on 10.8, rising, another 3 or 4 weeks, we'd have been on 15. That's what happens when you get pollsters that misunderstand that the systems and methodology they've got are failing in a modern society. I mean, today, how many times can you ring up and get a landline? So if you haven't got that sort of access to so many voters, and second, where so many voters won't tell you what they want to do or
Yeah.
what they're going to do, then you've got to write that into your outcomes. And we saw it in Brexit in the UK in 2016. We saw it in the USA in 2016, where you had journalists and commentators all crying on the night because they got it so wrong, somewhat disclosing their bias, I might add. Then you saw it in Australia, where the Labor Party lost the unlosable election in the last outing of Prime Minister Morrison when he became the Prime Minister of Australia. You would have thought after those three elections, they'd have thought to themselves, look, there's something wrong with polling. Maybe we better be a bit cautious. And what they do is write you off and then say, well, they write you down and then say, but you can never quite write them off. But writing them off is what they're trying to do. And unfortunately for them, there are other ways of seeing the electorate change. And in that context, we're relaxed about it. Before we even put the bus on the road, we were on our way seriously back. We were stopped because of the COVID-19 breakout. Mm-hmm. But we'll have that bus on the road very soon, and we're confident of the outcome.
So you think, even though we've had the COVID break, New Zealand's first on the way to re-election, that's what your inside sources are telling, your information's pointing towards?
Well, we look at the total electorate, at all the electorate. We don't look at a wish list. We go out there and make sure that as clearly and cleverly as we can, without being smart, but as cleverly as we can, we ensure that the people who would support our policies do get to hear about them and not hear fake imitations, so to speak. And boy, there are some fake imitations. Remember Colin Craig at the last two elections ago? Well, there was a fake imitation if ever was one. Then he had top with all their money. Gareth Morgan got 2%.
Yeah.
Look at the headlines and coverage they got. And look now at the different coverage that the ACT Party is getting compared to New Zealand First. We've been in here for all these years, and they've got a member who's been there like his predecessor and like his predecessor and like his predecessor, only one MP. How does this happen, mate? So in the ways I can understand, because if you understand that the ownership structure's on the hard right and the working structure's on the hard left. So you've got a certain aspect of the ownership structure of the media want one outcome, and then you've got the working frontline staff, mainly very young people and some very fresh out of university, who want a different outcome. And between the two of them, you get an unreconcilable tension. Whereas in other countries, you can rely upon different political backgrounds of the media, so that in the UK, you can buy the newspaper of your political choice, as you can in the United States, as you can in France. But in New Zealand, because of us being a small country, we have to be far more reliant on the integrity of the media, about being neutral. Now, with too many of them going on their track record, their neutrality is seriously in question.
Speaking of the National Party, not being able to get there with ACT, do you think Labor is at all in danger this time round because they're polling over 50%, and I know we don't talk about the polls, but they have such a high support, they're in danger at all of cannibalising the Greens and being exactly where National were last time around, that they'll end up on 45, 46, 47% and actually not have a partner to form government?
There'll always be a partner.
Yeah.
But you're actually looking at things realistically when you say, of course they're in danger in this circumstance. And this is not a comment against my coalition partner at this point in time. We signed up for 3 years. We kept our word. Mm-hmm. And on the 6th of August, when it was all over, in terms of our sitting until going to the election on the 19th of September, we'd passed over 190 pieces of legislation, which shows that it was a serious performance of agreement. But that said, I can remember Helen Clark calling a snap election. And when it was over, she'd lost about 12% in 7 weeks flat. So, you've got to be concerned when you hear these commentators who don't seem to understand that history has a way of repeating itself. and I'm saying this more as a person who's got a political science degree and has been in politics a long time, than just a New Zealand First Leader. In short, people should be more reserved about their opinions when they're making comments about the present political situation.
You were pretty quick after that, I think August 6th deadline, to make some comments in the press about, woe betide New Zealand if you leave this to a Greens Labour coalition after the election, obviously putting yourself forward as a good party to partner into the government after this election. Why do you have such concerns for a Labour Green only coalition moving forward?
Because New Zealand First brought enormous experience to this coalition, and it shows in many, many ways. It means that we kept through three crises, and the last one being COVID, as a united coalition government for the purpose of imaging unity to get the country through those crises. And that takes experience to do that. We don't start at shadows. We've seen a lot of this all before. And we brought, as I say, a very experienced coalition input, whereas the Greens had never been anywhere near government since the Values Party was their earliest shape in 1972. For decades, they never got within curry of government. And then you had so many members of the Labour Party front bench, including the Prime Minister, who had never been a minister, let alone the Prime Minister. That's not putting her down. It's really saying that you can look at people and say, with the right combination, we could make this work. And we did.
You don't want to put down the Prime Minister, as you said, not putting her down. But do you think that this election is going to be primarily decided on how the public feels about COVID? Do you think that's really the number one voting, whether it be how it's decided because of their businesses or their personal health, but that's really the main thing people are voting on this year?
My answer to you, to be exact, and putting my cards on the table, is if that's what it's about, then our campaign will have failed. Because it's far more about COVID. It's about how we're going to turn an economy that was already in trouble before COVID-19 arrived, because we'd inherited some serious maladjustments in the economy going back for many, many years. Exports in decline, manufacturing in decline, massive social infrastructure deficits, every DHB in trouble. That's every district health board. Sewage coming out of the Middlemore hospital walls. This is a catastrophic set of circumstances. And I'm saying it that when we look at COVID-19, this was already in place. Now COVID-19 means we've got one massive problem to turn this around. And so it's a time to look at the clever way of turning New Zealand around. And it's not going back to where we were before COVID-19, because we were not successful there. At that point in time, Australia had done so much better than us since the mid-1980s, probably in 38% in real terms better than us. So we had a long way to go. We've got the resources, we've got enormous assets, but we had to start thinking in a much more clever way about adding value to everything we possibly could. And funny enough, it's starting to emerge after COVID-19. People are seeing the value of certain fish products. They're beginning to see the value of, we're growing in Portuguese, the biggest mussel farm in the world. When you see the pharmaceutical products arising from that, it's an example of what can be done. And all of a sudden, we've just rediscovered, you wouldn't believe what we've rediscovered, but we've discovered the value of honey in terms of people's general health.
Yeah.
And that means all brands of honey, yet at the top of the line, you've got Manuka, which is the finest in the world.
Yep.
So it's a time to get ourselves properly organized. And then also, if you look at, we've got wool products. Wool is a tremendous insulation product. It is also safe. You're not going to get yourself choking from being in an insulated house that's insulated with wool, as opposed to the kind of product we're using right now with bats and what have you, where people have all got masks on.
Mm.
Some fundamental things are staring us in the face. And every time I watch Country Calendar, I see exciting people all out in the land, all over the country, doing something dramatically great for New Zealand. If we could only combine their sense of creativity in a wider population, we'd be off and running, because we've got what some countries have not got. Singapore hasn't got our resources.
Right.
Taiwan hasn't got our resources. But look what they've done by adding value. We've got the base as well. So we're a rich country in that context. And in fact, the Aussies will possibly begin to envy us when they look. If you look at the last summer's fires there in all parts of Australia, we're a lucky country and we've got a thing called water. But we've got to pick our game up, use our best experience, and deposit some of our ideology outside the door, and get on with doing practical, smart things, using our best science, our best people. And dare I say it, if we're going to have immigration, pick the very best who can add value. Not 72,000 was swarming in 2017 every year, and putting all sorts of stress on the system. But show some focus in every way, everything you do, strive for excellence, as we do on the sports paddock, as we do in cultural pursuits. So we must do so in politics as well.
So you really see COVID as almost like an ADBC. There's actually you draw a line in the sand saying there was life before COVID, life after COVID. It sounds like what you're saying is it's time to. I mean, we've talked obviously done lots of podcasts during COVID, lots of conversations with different people. COVID's been a topic of conversation, and the theme has been coming out that we are not only literally an island nation unto ourselves, but we can kind of be that island nation to the world as well, and things can go out from where we're at. And it feels similar to what you're talking about, maybe said slightly differently, but it could be a time for New Zealand to shine on the world scene over the next wee while.
Well, we spent far too many decades talking about the tyranny of distance. And all of a sudden, we just learned how lucky we are.
Yeah.
We'll take advantage of it, make the most of it. I'm hearing some astonishing ideas from former prime ministers saying we should allow multi-billionaires in here and all that sort of thing. And the answer is, well, if a multi-billionaire is going to come here and build a 10,000 employment industry and put his heart and soul into my country, like Singapore demanded, like Ireland demanded, like Taiwan demanded when they built their countries. And Singapore did it dramatically, and so did Taiwan. And so did Ireland in the 80s, begin to change their futures. Then I can see the sense in that. But just to talk about getting them a bolt hold without commitment, like some of the ones I've seen, is not a smart policy at all.
Am I right? And did I read that you have separated ways a little bit? It's the wrong way to say it, but disagree, shall I say, with maybe some of the government's ideas around border restrictions and rules post this second outbreak? Are you on a different page from the government for that?
You're right to say that. And you've got ministerial portfolios. You're responsible for the portfolio you're in. You might be in an all-cabinet situation, but it's the ministers that drive it. And we don't, New Zealand First, have any ministers in terms of that context for all these months. But we were for the use of masks from the very beginning because of the Taiwanese and other countries' experience. We were for having the military exclusively as fast as possible from the very beginning. Why? Because they can follow instructions. And we are for ensuring that the biggest population is not the place where we put people in quarantine. Put them somewhere like near Ohakia or somewhere near in Christchurch, out of town, at the military bases there, where they've got plenty of space and room. Why? So that you can ensure that there's not any chance of cross-contamination if you can possibly manage it. But that is something we've made it very clear. And if you're asking me, frankly, what was our position? Well, I'm telling you, it always has been. And a lot of these things, we can almost give you the date we said it.
Right. Speaking of putting places in Christchurch or putting places in Ohakia, at one stage it was reported that you made a claim to an Australian broadcaster that the current outbreak in Auckland came from an escapee from an isolation facility. First of all, is that correct that you said that? And if it is, do you still believe that?
No, that's false.
Okay.
That was put up there by some person with a malice and a forethought, claimed it was mine. It was totally false. I told an Australian journalist that we had a border security breach, and I stand by that. I'm not resigning from that. It's so elementary, I can't believe people would argue about it. First, we had, as you know, as what they put up by the health system, they said we had a unique strain of Corona-19 in our country. That wasn't true. Then they said the America cold was the source of imports of frozen food. That was demonstrably not true, even as they were saying it, because in America cold in Melbourne, they only had 2 in that factory, with everybody else COVID-free. the two in the factory that got it downtown, and that was the connection with Melbourne. So that collapsed about 4 or 5 days ago. And now we're being told, well, it's the bus travel. That's why we're getting masks. And you've got to ask yourself, really? Is that even plausible or feasible? And I'm saying, I'm not residing from it, and we'll see who's right or wrong, that this was a border security matter. But as you know, Sherlock Holmes would say, it is so elementary, I cannot believe people would argue about it. Unless they're concerned that having to admit that points to a breach of their own fulfillment of their duties.
It seems that we've been a mixture of good management and good luck, because a lot of us in the public, when we heard that people at the border weren't being tested more regularly, I mean, the blooming NBA players have made a bubble and they're getting tested every single day. And when we've heard stories about people at the border, working at the border, not being tested that much, some of us were shocked, and I think that was a bad decision. But it seems through good luck we haven't been hit, and fingers are very crossed when I say this, too badly by it. But if what you're saying is it's elementary, my dear Watson, you didn't quite say that, that it's got to be a border security.
Elementary, my dear Pat, I said.
Okay, fair enough. I guess that makes complete sense, because if it was out of our community, then the only place it could come back into our community was at the border. That's what you mean by it's elementary?
Or either that or came by UFO or came by aircraft up out of the sky. You know, I just want people to be putting their best case of evidence forward, because it wasn't making any sense to us. And you know, if you want to turn this thing around, and we want New Zealanders to be a team, then we've got to give them the best information we possibly can.
Do you think the government's done pretty well at doing that? Do you have any concerns? I mean, you're famous. I mean, I just think of the wine box for someone who's got to the bottom of things quickly and put information out there. Do you think the government's done a pretty good job of getting info out there accurately? Do you have any concerns about that? From your perspective, as to things not being quite as transparent as maybe you would have wanted?
I think, look, the government, and I don't want to say because it sounds like self-praise, but I think the Prime Minister and the government have done a very good job. With these exceptions, if you're relying upon a departmental or bureaucratic response, you have to know it's being done. In the same way as any general gives an instruction all the way down, he wants to, or she wants to find out, has it been done? And we found out that for months it hadn't been done in some cases, as we were giving assurances to the public that it had been. Now, in the end, we're lucky. You're so right. We're dead lucky to have got this far, but it's not good enough. And going forward, when we make a statement like that, we have to know that it is done. And that's why, for example, we always wanted the military. That's why we always wanted masks, because you can't argue with success. Taiwan has got almost 24 million people. It's got 7 deaths and under 500 cases.
Yeah.
And yet we had an apathy towards masks. And now they're saying, oh, well, we're using masks because we've got some cases have been picked up on a bus. Please don't tell me that the cases you've got on the bus are the only cases of COVID that were on the bus. Again, it's elementary. That other public transport had been used. Whether they can trace it to that is a different matter. But some of the statements you're one's making, if dare I say it, in a scientific investigation or court of law, wouldn't last 5 questions.
As someone in a party who has been supporting the mask idea for a long time, now that the mandates come in, you yourself, Mr. Peters, have you worn a mask through this at any stage when you're out and about?
Yeah, I have, and I put a mask on when I was on the Air New Zealand flights, when the first thing was a case of it coming back when the shutdown was over. And I'm glad I did. I put it out there because it was in May to say that it was important. Mm-hmm. And yet here we are, May, June, July, August, and it's coming in next Monday. You get my point?
Yeah. No, I was also interested as well, and I'll say this gently, being someone who worked on News Talk ZB for a good while, talking to an older demographic, it would seem that traditionally New Zealand first voters have been older on average, not entirely, but on average. So that also makes them the most sort of vulnerable in society for COVID. But also that's a group of society who seems to want to rebel against, reject, push back on the nanny state idea. And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
as the person they look up to, the leader of their party, how do you balance that this is what's best for your health and we won't allow this to turn into a nanny state? How do you find that middle ground?
Well, you got to appeal for their help. You know, you got to say, look, some of you remember darker days, Second World War. Some of you remember Korea. Some remember that the Depression didn't finish here in the 40s. It was still in New Zealand in the 50s for some parts of New Zealand. All we're doing is asking for your help. We can't do much more than that. But if you're going to get on a bus and you haven't got a mask, you won't be getting on the bus. If you're going to be in close community connection, or in some environment where you're going to be closely lined up near people in the social circumstance, you're going to wear a mask or it'll be stopped. I mean, you can't stand around while people want to argue the toss of whether they believe in that or not, because the answer is, well, you've got the freedom to get some other form of transport, and you've got the freedom to be somewhere else. But if you're going to be in this environment where we're required to, and the rest of your colleagues are required to foot the bill as to the outcome, then these are the laws you must obey.
What would you say? What would you say to those?
In the Second World War, in parts of the world, if you were to open at nighttime your blinds, then the whole neighborhood would be on your back that night.
Yeah, right.
In the dark, mind you, because now you're exposing yourself to great danger from being bombed from the sky. These are fundamental things that older people remember and were talked about. So you might think there's an element of Ned Kelly about them, but they can be persuaded.
What would you say to those bus drivers? And I read an article today that said that they're not going to be policing the masks. And they it's not my job. I'm not the mask police. What would you say to them?
Yeah, fair enough. Just say there with your phone and say, mate, you're not getting on here, otherwise the cops will be in 5 minutes flat. That's what I have to say. But surely they're not going to let them get on the thing without a mask when everybody else is on there with a mask.
Mm-hmm. Have you been following, I guess, closely what's been happening in the US, both with sort of civil unrest, protests, and also their response to COVID over there as well? Or have you been, focused on elections in New Zealand?
I've followed very closely around the world as best I could. I get reports from all around the world every week from Foreign Affairs internationally, our MFAT people telling me what's the latest in that country. It's quite considerable reading, actually. But yes, I have followed very closely the United States. I've followed very closely the UK. I've followed very closely Australia because of our, background and connection, I suppose.
And what are your thoughts on what America's going through at the moment, specifically around COVID? I just had a look at their, it's the World, I forget the name of the website. I can actually do this, Mr. Peters, and show it to you here. The world cases here where we're ticking up a little bit, but generally still down. America still seems to be primarily on an upward swing, although it is starting to taper a little bit. What are your thoughts about what's happening with COVID in the US?
Well, it's totally out of hand now, and whatever efforts they are making, state by state, the federal nature of their establishment, a bit like the federal nature of Australia, but more difficultly so in the United States case. You've got all sorts of state governments doing the reverse of what the central government's trying to do, or disagreeing with the central government. And I'm not entering the politics of whether they're right or wrong, but you can see if you've got people and states inside a country pulling in different directions, how difficult it's going to be. And I see it in Australia at the moment as well.
What do you think about what's happening with the protests over there? What do you think of Black Lives Matter and all the voices being heard on that issue at the moment?
Well, I'm saddened to see that, as George Floyd, the brother, said, you're not helping us at all. In fact, the Black Lives Matter movement has been taken over by a bunch of radicals without any concern for Black lives. That's my grave concern. Of course, Black lives matter. Everybody's life matters. White lives, brown lives, for want of a better phrase, in between lives. Everyone's lives matter. To turn into a cause that is then used for other purposes is the very worst circumstance. And I've seen it in the past where people say one thing, and I can recall the Vietnam War turned up right in the middle of the American civil rights movement. And the protesters vanished from the civil rights straight off to Vietnam. How do the black people feel then? Used. And a lot feel like that now in the United States.
I was wondering if you'd. I had a chat about on Facebook yesterday about you coming and having a chat with us today, and I was like, what are some questions people want to ask the Deputy Prime Minister? And one of the questions popped up, which I'm interested in, and that was about the future of New Zealand First. You are a healthy young man in the eyes of many, Mr. Peters, but at some stage you'll probably want to retire and go fishing more often.
I'm much younger than Joe Biden.
Oh, well, just tell us first, who's going to win in the US? Who do you think? What are your thoughts?
I'm prepared to put it in a sealed envelope, and we'll see who's got the expertise in this matter. I just love the way the commenters make all sorts of comments, and you say to them, well, why don't you actually write down right here, right now, who you think's going to win? They're not too keen on that. Been bitten too many times, but it doesn't restrain them from giving their views.
So a sealed envelope, where's that envelope going to be? I'll give you my PO box afterwards. You can send it to me, and I won't open it till after the election, and we'll see.
No, seriously, the equivalent of New Zealand equivalent of Fort Knox, so it can't be opened by anybody until after the election. But I'm happy to tell people publicly after the election. I did it with respect to Brexit. I did it with respect to Donald Trump's victory. For no other reason than I saw the disconnect between Washington and the ordinary voter. And I did it with respect to Australia. Again, not because I didn't know Shorten or a number of the people in the Labour Party, but I could see how an election that was unlosable was being lost. And it's important to, when you're evaluating politics, to never forget that out there, in our case, there are hundreds of thousands of forgotten people. And this election, like none before, they're going to be king. They'll know it.
Where I was going with that before I interrupted myself, which is a unique thing to do, was the future of New Zealand First, Mr. Peters. Once you decide that you want to go and retire and spend some more time fishing and stuff, what happens to New Zealand First? Because there is and it's tongue in cheek, and I do believe it's kind of said in a nice way. People joke about calling it Winston First, but obviously you want to see this go on. You believe in the policies. You want this to, be the third party or second party for a very long time. What happens next for New Zealand First?
Well, again, first of all, the reason why we don't have a conversation about the leadership of New Zealand First is that without being arrogant or modest, New Zealand First has got a leader. I'm looking at the National Party. It's got 4 leaders in the last 3 years. But look at the ACT Party. I mean, I don't know how many they've had, probably 9 in my time. I've seen over 9 prime ministers come and go. And so in the end, we've got no debate about the leadership of New Zealand First. It's because we've got a leader. But there's always somebody who can replace you. There's always somebody who can step up, and with the right help and assistance, and everybody needs assistance, as I did from the start. With the right help, they will make it. So I'm not concerned in that way. But I have been asked this question nearly all my career, leading New Zealand First. Now, nearly every election, what's going to happen after you? And I feel like saying to the journalists, well, what's going to happen after you? And guess what? 80% of them have come and gone in my time. They never told me what's going to happen after them.
Someone to take up the mantle. It's like you see, I'm not a journalist, so I don't have to worry about that so much. Hey, Mr. Peters, a couple of last things before we let you go. The 2 referendums coming up. Would you care to share your thoughts on how you're going to vote, or your thoughts around the euthanasia referendum and the cannabis referendum?
I to this extent, I don't want to contaminate the voters' view on how they should vote. And it looks like you've actually marshaled things to either facilitate one or other side. But we insisted in New Zealand First that no way we were going to have any votes of that type without it was put to the public of this country and not rely upon 120 very temporarily empowered politicians. And I'm glad of that. That's why this issue on legalizing marijuana or recreational marijuana is going to go to the public. And the issue of euthanasia is also going to go to the public. It's not an ACT Party consequence for doing that. If the ACT Party had persisted with their way, there would never be any referendum. But when they were desperate, they came to us, and we couldn't leave our position that if we're going to have a referendum on conscience, leave it to the public, not politicians who are out of step in many cases.
So does New Zealand First have an actual euthanasia position or a cannabis position?
No.
Not necessarily. So there's no position, nothing in the policies about the New Zealand First stance on them.
Well, you can't argue for the reason for a referendum much more widely.
Yeah.
as against the dictatorial behaviour from Wellington, and then they go out and say what you want, despite what the public image of what your argument is. We have said to the public, we trust you. We'll live with your answer. I wish other politicians would.
Hey, Mr. Peters, finally...
remember there was a referendum
Yep.
on the size of Parliament.
Yep.
Given that we've sold so many assets offshore in particular, and so many of our previous wealth had gone somewhere else, there was a petition for 100 members of Parliament. It got 82% of the vote. My party backed it. We're the only party that did. And then the two old parties just straight out and ignored it. So you see, there you are. 80% wanted, or didn't know, wanted one result, and 82% wanted a smaller Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't agree more. But this time we're saying, you're not going to ignore it. You're going to have to follow what the public want.
Yeah.
And I know that all sorts of sides of the argument wish it were not so. But what would they rather have? Trust their own neighbour, trust the millions of voters, or trust a few members of Parliament? And you know how fleeting that many of them have been here in time, and how little they know about the real world.
Mr. Peters, if you had have
My
been,
party accepted.
if you had have been here with us, Mr. Peters, would have offered you a beer, or maybe a whiskey or something as we're having our conversation? You're not with us, but I'm going to open one anyway for my last question. And my last question is quite simple. Man in his 40s, trying to get a small business off the ground, few kids, lives in Dunedin. Why would I vote for New Zealand First?
Oh, that's an obvious question, and the answer is because you need in government a party with a proven record of doing what it says it's going to do, ensuring that it makes the best of any negotiating circumstances in which they are involved, and has a record year after year of delivering on its commitments. Why do you think we've got 1 billion trees being planted? Why have we got $3 billion of provincial growth money being expended? Why is railways being revived, and East Town down in your part of the world is going to be revived and building railway utilities coming up in the future? Why would it be in Dunedin, in the hinterland of rural agriculture in that part of the world, so dependent on the currency at the right rate? Not 82, 83 cents US, but 64, 65 US. There are 1,000 reasons why I could tell you people like you should be voting for New Zealand First. And one other thing, we've been in business. We know what it's like to start a business. How many politicians can make that claim and run a very successful business? So we understand the need to ensure that businesses get the right help, get the right tax help, get the right depreciation help, get a policy that is sympathetic to their important role. Because you can't be an employer of any worker unless you can make a profit and survive without risking every darn thing, including your house. You need a government to understand the commercial realities. And my party's loaded up with people with a commercial background. Shane Jones is another one. And you need those people in Parliament, because the disconnect between so many members of Parliament and the actual reality on the ground knows no bounds. Let me ask you this question. What does Goldsmith, from the National Party's finance spokesman, what does he know about a business? What business did he ever run? Or Jerry Brownlee? What business did he ever run? I can go one after the other and say, what was your business background? Now, I'll leave the other side of Labour Party to ask the same question as well.
Yeah.
So why would I vote for New Zealand First? Well, here's the promise. You can indulge yourself on your first vote the way Granddad did, your great-grandfather did, or Mum and Dad, or dare I say it, your wife and children want you to vote. But on your second vote, I'd buy yourself some serious insurance, and I'd party vote New Zealand First.
It's not a bad message there, Mr. Peters. I don't know if you've practiced that one, but it's a pretty good elevator pitch. I was just thinking that...
The original one is true.
Yeah, it's not bad. Hey, cheers. Thank you for joining us today. The plan was always, obviously, as leaders go around the country, to catch up with them. Obviously, COVID has changed lives, everybody. It's changed it for us and how we operate as well, and you're looking at it right now. But I do really appreciate in this very busy, hectic time, especially with what's going on with COVID and lockdowns, et cetera, you still find 45 minutes or so to have a chat with us. It was very enjoyable. And hopefully what it gave you is a little bit more time. That's what we try and do. It's not we don't try and I was going to mention a journalist's name, which I won't. We don't try and jump in and cut off. And I just want you to share your thoughts, let people hear your thoughts, and give everyone the same opportunity to do so.
Well, look, thank you very much. Can I just say there's so many journalists that jump in when you're halfway through the answer. In fact, you've just got 3 words out and they think, oh, I didn't phrase that sentence or my question properly, so I'll jump in now. And it's terrible. But can I just say, I forgot to say about Dunedin, you're a city with a Scots heritage. One thing the Scots do is know about money. They know you've got to save it. And they know you've got to be frugal. And it just so happens that my party's loaded up with Scotsmen as well. And this is my commitment to you. I'll be as careful about spending your money as I am about spending my own. How's that?
I guess that's all we can really ask. I mean, so often within politics and within government, I liken what's going on in Treasury or what's going on with budgets to a household budget. And so, hearing you say that makes me think, well, yeah, if I'm going to watch my pennies in my house, then it'd be good for you to watch my pennies in Treasury and from the tax that's being paid. So makes sense to me.
Well, we've got a long record of 27 years of being the most low-cost party in terms of parliamentary services of any other political party by miles. And not one journalist has ever said, that's great, there's something about that party that we like because they're frugal with the public purse. In some years, we've spent less than half of our parliamentary entitlement. No other party remotely can say that, and most of them have overspent and reorganised it for the next year. So that's the way it goes. I just thought I'd make that point because the Dunedinites would need to know that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Peters, Deputy Prime Minister. Appreciate your time and all the best with the election.
Thank your viewers.
I'm sure they'll love to hear from you as well.